It was a Sunday morning, June 28th, 1914. The air over Sarajevo was warm, the city restless, but festive. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, had come to inspect military troops. A visit meant to show unity, but one that carried tension beneath every polite smile. Crowds lined the Appel-Quay along the Moljaka River. Flags hung from balconies. The mayor rehearsed his welcome speech. The orchestra tuned its instruments. Few realized that among the cheering faces, 7 young men stood silent, waiting, each carrying bombs or pistols wrapped in newspapers. They were members of a secret organization called the Black Hand, Serb nationalists who dreamed of freeing Bosnia from Austro-Hungarian control and uniting it with Serbia. Their leader on the ground was Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old student. To him, the Archduke symbolized occupation, not peace. The Archduke's car, an open-top 1911 Graf and stiff double phaeton, rolled from the train station toward the city hall. Beside him sat his wife, Duchess Sophie. Neither wore body armor. They trusted the route was secure. The police had warned of threats, but officials dismissed them. Sarajevo, they said, is loyal. First attempt, the bridge. At around 10 a.m., the motorcade reached the Kumurija Bridge. Assassin Nedeljko Kabranovic stepped forward and hurled a hand grenade toward the Archduke's car. It bounced off the folded convertible top and exploded under the following vehicle, wounding several officers and bystanders. Panic spread. Soldiers drew pistols. Kabranovic swallowed a cyanide capsule and leapt into the river. But the poison was old, and the river barely knee-deep. He was dragged out and beaten before police hauled him away. Franz Ferdinand's driver pressed the accelerator. They sped to the city hall, shaken but alive. At the city hall, inside the hall, the mayor began his prepared welcome, but the Archduke cut him off. "Mr. Mayor, I came here on a visit, and I am greeted with bombs." His voice echoed off the marble walls. Yet within minutes, he calmed. He insisted the official events continue, then decided to visit the wounded officers in the hospital before returning to the station. It was a fatal act of duty, one that would send history spinning. A wrong turn. The Archduke's driver was not informed that the route had been changed for security. Instead of turning toward the hospital, he stayed on the Appel-Quay. At the corner of Franz Joseph Street, the car slowed to reverse. Standing there, by pure chance, was Gavrilo Princip. He had given up earlier, thinking the mission failed. Now the Archduke's car stopped just meters from him. He stepped forward, raised his pistol, and fired 2 shots. One bullet struck the Duchess in the abdomen. The second hit the Archduke in the neck. Sophie, don't die. Stay alive for our children," he whispered as blood filled his uniform. Within minutes, both were dead. The city froze in disbelief. In Vienna, telegrams flew. By evening, the world's great powers were moving their pieces, unaware that the first domino had fallen. Aftermath of the day. Princip was captured alive. Crowds tried to lynch him. Soldiers dragged him away. He was only 19, too young for execution under Austrian law. He would die in prison 4 years later of tuberculosis, but his act would live far longer. The Austro-Hungarian Empire blamed Serbia. Vienna demanded retribution. Europe held its breath. News travels strangely fast when it carries tragedy. By noon on June 28, 1914, telegraph lines from Bosnia to Vienna hummed with urgency. The message was short, but history felt it instantly. His Imperial Highness and the Duchess are dead, victims of assassination in Sarajevo. Inside the ornate rooms of the Ballhausplatz, the Austro-Hungarian Foreign Office, clerks froze mid-motion. Within the hour, the telegram reached Emperor Franz Joseph himself, the aging monarch who had ruled since before most of Europe's soldiers were born. He was dining when the aide entered. The plate before him trembled. He removed his glasses, silent for a long time. Then he said quietly, "A higher power has restored the order that I could not." It sounded like grief, but underneath lay something else, weariness, perhaps even resignation. To him, the murder was more than an attack on his family. It was an attack on the empire itself. The empire reacts. Across Austria-Hungary, The mood twisted quickly. In cafes and marketplaces, the first rumor spread. The Serbs did it. Crowds turned violent in Sarajevo. Serb-owned shops were smashed, windows shattered, flags torn down. By afternoon, anti-Serb riots erupted. A city that had been festive that morning now burned in its own anger. In Budapest and Vienna, newspapers rushed out extra editions. Black borders framed the Archduke's portrait. Editors speculated on Serbian involvement long before evidence existed. Public opinion hardened within hours. The empire's ministers gathered in emergency session. Foreign Minister Leopold von Berchtold pounded the table. This crime cannot go unpunished. Military Chief Konrad von Hotzendorf agreed instantly. He had long argued for a preventive war against Serbia, but they hesitated, not from doubt, but from calculation. They knew Serbia was small, yet backed by Russia. If they struck too soon, the flames might leap the borders. Still, that afternoon, telegrams went to Berlin, seeking reassurance from their ally, the German Empire. Berlin's response, the blank check. In Potsdam, Kaiser Wilhelm II was hosting a regatta when the news reached him. He reportedly slammed his fist and declared, "This is outrageous. The Serbs must be crushed." Yet, within his anger lay political opportunity. Germany's generals saw a moment to strengthen their alliance and test their readiness. Within a few days, they would send Vienna what history now calls the blank check, a promise of full German support if Austria chose war. But on that first day, the reactions were confusion and disbelief. Europe had seen assassinations before. Few expected one to ignite a world war. Most thought it would pass as another Balkan incident, soon forgotten. Meanwhile, in Belgrade, Serbian Prime Minister Nikola Pašić received partial reports. He was horrified but cautious. He feared Austria would accuse Serbia regardless of evidence. That night, he ordered the army quietly mobilized, a precaution that Vienna would later call proof of guilt. The investigations began. Back in Sarajevo, investigators moved through chaos. Princip and his surviving accomplices were interrogated through the night. Under beatings, they named their contacts, members of the secret Serbian military intelligence. Their weapons, traced to Belgrade, provided Vienna the justification it needed. Austrian officials drafted a report before midnight. They declared the plot directed from Serbia. But still, within the chancelleries, there was hesitation. Should they seek justice, or seize the moment to destroy a rival? By 8 p.m., Vienna's newspapers spoke not of mourning but of vengeance. Editorials shouted, "Serbia must be punished." Public grief was being shaped into public fury. The monarch and the nation, Emperor Franz Joseph, ordered the court into deep mourning. Yet in private, he seemed detached, perhaps exhausted by a lifetime of losses. His son had died years before. His wife, Empress Elizabeth, had been assassinated in 1898. Now his heir was gone, but others around him saw not sorrow, but strategy. With the Archduke gone, the hawkish ministers gained influence. The path toward confrontation widened. Evening falls on Europe. That evening, Vienna's cafes filled with murmurs. Some toasted revenge, others whispered of danger. The empire's parliament adjourned in silence. Church bells tolled across the capital. In Sarajevo, the bodies of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie lay in a candlelit barracks hall, guarded by soldiers who could barely stand from exhaustion. A journalist wrote in his notebook, "The air feels heavy, as if the city knows more than we do." Across the continent, in London, Paris, St. Petersburg, diplomats dined unaware that the clock of destiny had started ticking. Within 30 days, every capital in Europe would be mobilizing for war. The world slept uneasily after Sarajevo. The morning of June 29, 1914, the sun rose over Vienna's palaces and Belgrade's riverbanks, but something in the air had changed. What had seemed like a tragic local murder was already swelling into an empire's cause. A week of mourning and calculation. For 7 days, the Austro-Hungarian Empire stood in mourning. Flags hung at half-mast, theaters were closed, and newspapers filled with portraits of the fallen Archduke. But behind the heavy drapes of the Hofburg Palace, diplomacy and revenge began to share the same table. Foreign Minister Berchtold convened his advisers daily. Some urged restraint, investigate first, punish later. But General Konrad von Hotzendorf was relentless. He had argued for years that Serbia was a viper in the nest, feeding nationalism within the empire's borders. Now, he said, the time had come. Either we strike now, or we watch our empire rot from within. The emperor listened, silent as usual. His only instruction was to act with dignity. But to men like Berchtold and Hotzendorf, dignity meant power. Berlin's signal, the blank check delivered. On July 5, 1914, Austria sent its envoy to Berlin. He carried a confidential report of the assassination investigation and an unspoken question. Will Germany stand with us if we strike Serbia? The answer came swiftly and privately. Kaiser Wilhelm II, after reviewing the case, assured Vienna of his full support, whatever the cost. Historians would later call it the blank check, a promise that emboldened Austria more than anything else. With Germany's military might at their back, Austrian leaders no longer debated whether to punish Serbia, but how severely. The decision marked the true beginning of the crisis. The ultimatum takes shape. Throughout early July, the Austrian government crafted its move. Draft after draft was written, sharpened, and rewritten. The final document, finished on July 19th, was designed not for negotiation, but for rejection. It accused Serbia of complicity in the Sarajevo murders and demanded humiliating concessions. Publicly denounce all anti-Austrian propaganda. Dismiss any officer linked to nationalist groups. Allow Austrian officials to conduct investigations inside Serbia. That last demand crossed the line. It violated Serbia's sovereignty, and everyone knew Belgrade could not accept it. Yet Austria waited to deliver it, ensuring its ally Germany returned from diplomatic travels and Russia remained unprepared. They chose July 23rd, late in the afternoon, to hand it over. Serbian Prime Minister Nikola Pašić read the document in disbelief. He asked for 48 hours to consult his cabinet. Austria gave him 48 hours, no more. Europe watches the clock. From London to St. Petersburg, diplomats scrambled. Foreign ministers wired each other frantically. Restrain Vienna. Restrain Belgrade. But the machinery of pride was already moving. In Paris, the French government supported its ally Russia, but urged patience. In London, Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey hoped to mediate. The lamps are going out all over Europe, he would soon say, and we shall not see them lit again in our lifetime. For now, though, the lamps still burned faintly. The Serbian reply. By July 25th, Serbia answered the ultimatum. The tone was respectful but firm. They accepted most demands, but rejected the clause allowing Austrian investigators on Serbian soil. They offered instead to submit the matter to international arbitration, a reasonable compromise by any measure. But Austria had already decided. That same evening, its ambassador in Belgrade packed his bags. Within hours, diplomatic relations were severed. Crowds gathered outside the royal palace. Pašić addressed them briefly. We have done all that honor allows. The Serbian army began mobilizing quietly along the Danube. Austria declares war. At 11 a.m. on July 28, 1914, exactly 1 month after the assassination, the Austro-Hungarian Empire declared war on Serbia. Church bells rang in Vienna. Crowds cheered in the streets, waving flags. They called it the cleansing storm. A short, glorious campaign to restore order. But a few older officers looked away. They had seen storms before. They knew they never stayed small. That evening, the first artillery shells were fired across the Sava River toward Belgrade. The explosions echoed down the valleys, and with them, the first true sounds of World War I began. The world tilts. Within 2 days, Russia began to mobilize in defense of Serbia. Germany, bound to Austria, prepared to mobilize in response. France quietly readied its army. The dominoes, once steady for decades, were falling one after another. By the last hours of July, no one could stop them. Every telegram, every order, Every message of reassurance carried with it a silent undertone of doom. The war that began with one pistol shot in Sarajevo was now a fuse burning across a continent. This was no longer just a murder or a regional conflict. This was the end of the old world. By the final days of July 1914, Europe was moving, not in debate, not in diplomacy, but in trains and orders. What had begun with a single gunshot in Sarajevo now rolled like thunder from one empire to the next. July 29th, Russia moves first. When the Austro-Hungarian artillery struck Belgrade, the news reached St. Petersburg before dawn. Tsar Nicholas II read the dispatch twice, his hands trembling. He wired his cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm II, pleading for restraint. "I beg you, stop your ally from going too far." But his generals pressed him. If Serbia falls, Russia loses her honor. By that afternoon, Russia ordered partial mobilization along the Austrian border. Mobilization, the word that terrified Europe. It meant trains, timetables, and millions of men. It meant war could no longer be stopped by words. Berlin answers. In Berlin, the news arrived like a challenge. Kaiser Wilhelm was furious. To him, Russian mobilization was a direct threat. He called his chief of staff, Helmuth von Moltke, and demanded plans. Germany had long prepared for this. The Schlieffen Plan, a blueprint for a two-front war. Strike France first through Belgium, defeat it quickly, then turn east against Russia. It was elegant in theory, and completely dependent on speed. Wilhelm hesitated for hours, torn between family ties and military logic. That night, he wrote again to Nicholas. "You mobilize against my ally. I must act to protect mine." The cousins signed their telegrams Willie and Nicky. But beneath the affection, the world was cracking. August 1st, Germany declares war on Russia. The declaration came at 5 p.m., August 1st, 1914. Crowds in Berlin cheered wildly, singing patriotic songs. They believed the war would be over by Christmas. Trains began to roll west. Men in new uniforms leaned out of windows, waving flowers, thrown by strangers. Few realized they were leaving for years, or forever. France mobilizes. Across the Rhine, France had waited, bound by its alliance with Russia, yet hoping to delay the inevitable. When Germany declared war, Paris responded within hours. Mobilization orders spread through every village. Posters went up on stone walls. Mobilization General. Bells rang. Men kissed their wives, pulled on worn coats, and joined columns marching toward the nearest rail line. They carried bread, photographs, and quiet fear. In cafes, people spoke of honor, revenge, and Alsace-Lorraine. The provinces lost 43 years earlier in the Franco-Prussian War. To many, this was the moment to reclaim them. To others, it was the end of everything they knew. August 3rd, the march through Belgium. Germany now faced a choice. To reach Paris quickly, they would march through Belgium, a neutral nation protected by international treaty. Belgium refused passage. King Albert I stood firm. A country does not defend itself only for its own territory. It defends its honor. Germany invaded anyway on August 3rd. That decision would bring Britain into the war within 24 hours. August 4th, Britain enters the conflict. In London, the cabinet met late into the night. Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey stood by the window overlooking St. James's Park as the lamps were being lit. He turned to his colleague and said the line that would echo for generations. "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." At 11 p.m., Britain declared war on Germany. Church bells rang again, but this time not in celebration. It was a dirge for peace. A world engulfed. Within a week, nearly every major power in Europe was at war. Austria-Hungary against Serbia. Germany against Russia and France. Britain and Belgium now in the fight. Italy hesitated, claiming its alliance did not apply to aggression. The Ottoman Empire and Japan would join later that year. What began as a Balkan tragedy was now the first truly global conflict. Mobilization scenes across the continent. In Vienna, recruits marched through Ringstrasse under a rain of flowers. In Berlin, Schoolboys paraded behind brass bands. In Paris, women waved handkerchiefs from balconies as trains departed. The posters promised glory, duty, honor. But the reality moved silently behind them. Factories retooled for shells. Hospitals cleared for the wounded. Fields left empty as men vanished into the trains. One Austrian officer wrote in his diary, "I saw the men smile as they left. None of them will ever smile that way again." The Great Departure. By mid-August, Europe was a continent in motion. 5 million men under arms. Thousands of trains crossing borders day and night. The rhythm of civilization replaced by the rhythm of marching boots. Families waved from platforms. Children ran beside the rails until they fell behind. Mothers tried to memorize the faces disappearing into the smoke. In every capital, leaders promised the same thing. It will be quick. It will be clean. We will be home by Christmas. But the trains did not carry men home. They carried them to a new kind of war, one the world had never seen. The war arrives. By the month's end, the first major battles ignited. Liège, the frontier of Belgium, held for days against impossible odds. German artillery pounded cities into dust. Civilians fled by the tens of thousands. Refugees filled roads that led nowhere. In the east, Russian and Austrian troops clashed in Galicia. In the west, France braced for the blow that would soon fall across the Marne. The world had changed, and there would be no going back. Closing narration, transition to next episode. Voice steady, low reflective tone. And so it began. In the space of 30 days, from one street corner in Sarajevo to the battlefields of Belgium and France, Europe had transformed itself into a machine of war. Empires moved like giants. Nations followed. And the ordinary people, the ones who cheered, wept, and marched, would soon discover the true cost of loyalty. This was the opening act, the moment the lights dimmed on the old world. Pause. It is not the end. In the next video, we'll walk step by step into the front lines, to see how modern warfare was born from trenches, gas, and endless mud. This was the spark. What comes next is the fire. The news spread like a shockwave through Europe's capitals. Telegraph lines buzzed with frantic messages. Ambassadors raced through corridors. Every nation now had one question. Could war still be stopped? In London, Britain called for a peace conference. Grey pleaded with Vienna and Berlin to pause mobilization. In Paris, the French government was cautious. President Poincaré was returning from a visit to Russia, and no one wanted to act without coordination. In Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm still believed that mediation could preserve peace, but his generals were already preparing plans. And in St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas II faced a terrible choice. If Austria attacked Serbia, could he remain silent? Or would honor and Slavic kinship force him to act? The Tsar wrote to Wilhelm, "I beg you, in the name of our old friendship, do not let your ally crush Serbia." But the machinery of alliance had already begun to grind. The military machines stir. Railroads, the nervous system of war, came alive. In Austria, mobilization orders moved secretly. In Germany, reserve units were quietly notified. And in Russia, ministers debated partial mobilization. A phrase that meant little, for once the wheels began turning, they could not easily stop. The illusion of control. In every capital, leaders believed they still had control. They signed papers, sent telegrams, gave speeches of caution and restraint. But in reality, the armies, not the politicians, were already in motion. The news spread like a shockwave through Europe's capitals. Telegraph lines buzzed with frantic messages. Ambassadors raced through corridors. Every nation now had one question. Could war still be stopped? In London, Britain called for a peace conference. Grey pleaded with Vienna and Berlin to pause mobilization. In Paris, the French government was cautious. President Poincaré was returning from a visit to Russia, and no one wanted to act without coordination. In Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm still believed that mediation could preserve peace, but his generals were already preparing plans. And in St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas II faced a terrible choice. If Austria attacked Serbia, could he remain silent? Or would honor and Slavic kinship force him to act? The Tsar wrote to Wilhelm, "I beg you, in the name of our old friendship, do not let your ally crush Serbia." But the machinery of alliance had already begun to grind. The military machines stir. Railroads, the nervous system of war, came alive. In Austria, mobilization orders moved secretly. In Germany, reserve units were quietly notified. And in Russia, ministers debated partial mobilization. A phrase that meant little, for once the wheels began turning, they could not easily stop. The illusion of control. In every capital, leaders believed they still had control. They signed papers, sent telegrams, gave speeches of caution and restraint. But in reality, the armies, not the politicians, were already in motion. On July 27th, Austria-Hungary formally declared war on Serbia. Artillery batteries opened fire across the Danube. Bridges burned. Columns of smoke rose over Belgrade. Europe heard the first thunder of modern war. The Tsar decides. In Russia, Nicholas II struggled. He wrote again to Wilhelm. Their letters, signed Nicky and Willie, still used the language of cousins, not enemies. But beneath those polite words was dread. Russia could not watch Serbia fall. On July 29th, the Tsar ordered partial mobilization against Austria. But the Russian generals argued, "You cannot mobilize halfway. If we begin, we must move against Germany too." That night, the order was changed to full mobilization. The dominoes had fallen. Berlin reacts. In Berlin, the Kaiser felt betrayed. He saw Russian mobilization as an act of war. His advisors urged him to act before it was too late. The German General Staff, led by Helmuth von Moltke, pressed for immediate mobilization. They warned, "If we wait, we will lose our advantage. Strike now, or be crushed later." In the small hours of July 30th, telegraph wires crackled with messages that would end peace forever. The first week of August, 1914, the mobilizations were complete. Europe was now an armed continent, a machine with no off switch. And for the first time in history, millions of men stood face to face across borders, waiting for orders that would end an age and begin something entirely new. Belgium burns the Battle of Liège. On August 5th, German troops crossed into Belgium, their gray uniforms almost blending with the mist of the Meuse Valley. Their first target was the fortress city of Liège, a ring of 12 concrete forts designed to hold any invader for weeks. But the Germans came with something Europe had never seen before: the Big Bertha howitzers, massive siege guns capable of hurling shells the size of small cars. At dawn, the first of these shells landed. Each explosion shattered concrete walls like paper. Civilians fled through the smoke. By nightfall, flames lit the sky above the city. The German army expected to march through easily, but the Belgian defenders, outnumbered, outgunned, fought back with ferocity. For 3 days, the Belgians held. They used machine guns from the fort tunnels, rifles from rooftops, even street barricades built from furniture. The resistance stunned Germany and delayed their advance just long enough for France and Britain to finish mobilizing. The German generals took the city only on August 7th, but at a cost of thousands. And what was meant to be a quick victory became the first symbol of resistance in Europe. The civilian tragedy, the rape of Belgium. As the German army pushed deeper into Belgium, discipline broke down. Convinced that civilians were sniping at their troops, German soldiers began a campaign of terror. Villages were burned. Hostages were executed in the streets. In Louvain, a medieval university town, the ancient library, filled with manuscripts from the Middle Ages, was set ablaze. The destruction shocked the world. Newspapers in London, Paris, and New York called it the Rape of Belgium. It became the first great propaganda story of the war, and it turned neutral opinion, especially in the United States, against Germany. But on the ground, it was simpler and crueler. A frightened army in enemy country, punishing everything it did not understand. The Western Front forms. By mid-August, German columns rolled westward, crossing rivers and farmlands toward France. Their orders were clear: crush the French armies before Russia could fully mobilize. It was a plan of speed, a race against time itself. In response, France launched its own offensive, Plan 17, a strategy fueled by pride and revenge. French troops in bright blue coats and red trousers charged across the borders of Alsace and Lorraine, believing courage alone could defeat artillery. They met machine guns instead. At Mulhouse, the first major engagement on the Western Front, French soldiers fell and rose before even seeing the enemy. Officers shouted, "En avant," for the homeland, but the old world of cavalry and bayonets could not survive the new one of steel and shrapnel. The British Expeditionary Force arrives. As France bled in Alsace, the first British troops, the British Expeditionary Force, or BEF, landed quietly in France. They were professional soldiers, small in number but highly trained. Commanded by Sir John French, they moved toward the Belgian frontier to meet the advancing Germans. For the British people, the war still felt distant. Something happening over there. Newspapers showed photographs of soldiers waving from trains, but few understood that they were entering the largest war the world had ever seen. The Eastern Front opens, while the West exploded. In the East, the Russian armies began moving faster than anyone expected. Within 10 days of mobilization, 2 massive Russian armies crossed into East Prussia. Germany had believed they would take 6 weeks to be ready. Instead, they arrived in less than 3. The Germans, caught off guard, rushed divisions from the Western Front to face them. It was a critical decision, one that would shape the coming Battle of the Marne. The war spreads. In the same days, across oceans and colonies, the war rippled outward. Japan, honoring its alliance with Britain, declared war on Germany. In Africa, German colonies faced attacks from British and French forces. In the Pacific, warships sailed under new orders. It was no longer a European war. It was a world war. Life behind the lines. By mid-August, trains still thundered through Europe, not carrying soldiers forward, but wounded men back. Hospitals filled. Letters began arriving home, the first from the front. "We have seen death," wrote one French corporal. "It is not glorious. It is not noble. It is mud, smoke, and silence." Families in Paris, Berlin, and Vienna waited at railway stations for news that never came. Women took jobs in factories. Children began collecting metal for shells. The war was no longer on the borders. It was inside every home. The illusion of short war. And yet, despite everything, the dead, the smoke, the fires, most people still believed it would end quickly. By Christmas, they said, their husbands, fathers, and sons would be home. Few realized that by that same Christmas, over 1 million men would already be dead or wounded. The machine had been built, and now it was running on its own momentum. No one could stop it. Voice softens, fading orchestral strings. The spark from Sarajevo had become a wildfire, burning across nations, across oceans, across generations. This was not a war of weeks. It was the birth of a century. It is not the end. In the next episode, we'll move deeper, into the trenches, into the mud, into the unbroken horror that defined the next 4 years. We will see how the modern world was forged not in peace, but in the endless noise of the Great War. After the guns of August came the silence of December, a silence filled not with peace, but waiting. By November 1914, the Western Front had settled into mud. The last open battles faded into the endless line of trenches. The soldiers, once told they'd be home by Christmas, now built walls of earth around themselves. Homes, graves, and prisons all in one. The first winter of the war was brutal beyond imagination. Frostbite blackened fingers. Water froze in helmets. Men huddled under rotting sandbags, listening to the constant drip of melted snow in the trench floor. On both sides, morale collapsed. Letters from home became lifelines. Censorship hid the truth, but word spread anyway. The war was not ending. It had only just begun. The Christmas truce. Then, on Christmas Eve, 1914, something extraordinary happened. Across parts of the Western Front, the guns fell silent. From the German lines came the faint sound of singing. Still Nacht. British soldiers listened, then joined softly with Silent Night. By dawn, men climbed out of their trenches, meeting in the frozen no-man's land between. They shook hands. They shared cigarettes, buttons, photographs. A football was kicked, and for a few brief hours, enemies became human again. But by the next day, the officers ordered them back. The guns roared once more. The war resumed, and no truce like that would ever happen again. Winter battles. As 1915 began, the frozen fields turned to swamps. Battles like Neuve-Chapelle and Ypres erupted, testing new weapons, chlorine gas, a sickly green cloud that crept along the ground and burned men alive. The war had entered a darker phase, a scientific war. Men fought not for land, but for survival. The world takes sides. Far from the trenches, other nations watched and waited. In Constantinople, the Ottoman Empire joined Germany and Austria. In Italy, politicians debated whether to switch sides. In London, propaganda began to paint the war as a fight for civilization itself. The first winter of the Great War ended not with victory, but with exhaustion. Europe was frozen, its armies buried in ice and disbelief. After the Battle of the Marne, Europe believed the worst was over. The German advance had been halted, Paris was saved, and people dared to hope that peace might return by Christmas. But the armies were not done. Both sides now sought to outflank the other, to strike from the north, where open ground still remained. From the Aisne River to the fields of Picardy, the French and Germans raced each other toward the English Channel. Each tried to move faster, to attack from the side and end the deadlock. This desperate maneuver became known as the Race to the Sea. Endless flanking battles. Day after day, divisions marched and dug, then marched again, only to meet the enemy in yet another trench line. The landscape changed, but the pattern remained: attack, counterattack, and trench repeat. At Arras, the French fought fiercely to hold the crossroads. At La Bassée, British forces met their first heavy casualties. In Lille, German shells turned entire neighborhoods into smoking craters. Farm fields became battlefields. Cows and crops were buried under wire and debris. Villages disappeared from the maps. By October, both sides had reached the North Sea. There was no more room to maneuver. The line was unbroken, a continuous wall of trenches stretching 400 miles from the Swiss border to the Channel. The war of movement had ended. A new kind of war had begun. The soldiers realized the truth. Letters from the front revealed the growing despair. "We dig all day, we shoot all night." One German private wrote, "We are told to advance, but there is nowhere left to go." The generals still spoke of victory. The soldiers spoke only of survival. By late October, the last open battle of the first campaign began, the First Battle of Ypres. It was meant to be the final push to break the enemy's line. Instead, it became a slaughterhouse. The battlefield of Ypres. The ancient Belgian town of Ypres was surrounded by flat, open farmland. Rain turned the soil to mud. Artillery fire churned the fields into swamps of blood and wreckage. Young volunteers, schoolboys, clerks, and farmers found themselves facing German regulars armed with machine guns. The British territorial units fought alongside Indian divisions, brought from across the empire to fill the gaps. Their turbans and bright uniforms stood out against the gray sky, easy targets in a war that rewarded invisibility. Still, they held their lines, at terrible cost. The death of the old army. By the time the battle ended in November, the British Expeditionary Force, the professional army that had landed only months earlier, was nearly destroyed. Of 160,000 men, fewer than half remained. In London, recruiting offices flooded with new volunteers. They called them Kitchener's Army, ordinary citizens who would become soldiers in the new year. But on the fields of Ypres, mud covered the bodies of the old army. They had held the line. Europe would never be the same. The frozen line. When the guns finally fell silent, there was no victory, only exhaustion. Both sides dug deeper. Winter was coming, and with it, the realization that this war would not end in 1914. War was no longer only fought with guns. By 1915, it was fought with words, pictures, and belief. The front line was everywhere, even in the newspapers. The war of lies. Governments on all sides launched massive propaganda campaigns. Posters showed soldiers as heroes, enemy nations as beasts. In Britain, a famous slogan appeared: "Your country needs you." Millions enlisted, inspired by pride and delusion. In Germany, newspapers promised a final victory. In France, teachers told school children that the war was sacred, that France fought for justice and light. Truth became a weapon, shaped and fired with precision. Women and industry. On the home front, women stepped into roles once closed to them, factories filled with smoke and noise. As women produced shells, rifles, and uniforms, they called them munitionettes. Their faces yellowed from TNT powder. They worked 12-hour shifts, often in silence, knowing their labor kept the war alive. Children collected metal scraps for recycling. Old men guarded railways. Entire societies became part of the machine of war, the cost of patriotism. But not everyone believed. In Germany, food shortages began. In Britain, soldiers wrote home about mud, rats, and terror. Stories censored but whispered anyway. In Russia, millions of peasants marched to the front without boots. Propaganda promised glory. Reality gave only grief. Music, film, and control. Governments used film for the first time. Short reels showing soldiers smiling before the camera. Audiences cheered in cinemas, never seeing what happened after the filming stopped. By 1915, the war had created a new kind of truth, one carefully edited, one designed not to inform, but to endure. While Europe froze in stalemate, the Allies sought another path. If they could not break Germany in the West, they would strike through the East. Gallipoli, the forgotten gamble. In April 1915, Allied forces, British, French, Australian, and New Zealand troops, landed on the rocky beaches of Gallipoli, hoping to capture the Dardanelles and open a sea route to Russia. But the cliffs were defended by the Ottoman Turks, commanded by Mustafa Kemal, a young officer whose leadership turned the tide. The beaches became death traps. Heat, disease, and sniper fire cut men down before they even reached the shore. The water ran red with blood and oil. By December, the Allies withdrew. 250,000 men had died. For nothing. Gallipoli was not just a defeat. It was a lesson in arrogance. The war had no easy front. No simple victory. The Eastern Front, a war of giants. Meanwhile, in the East, the Russian Empire fought Germany and Austria across vast plains. Battles like Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes saw armies of hundreds of thousands clash. Entire divisions vanished. Prisoners filled trains bound for camps. And in the Russian heartland, hunger and anger began to rise. A storm that would later become revolution. The global war grows. By the end of 1915, the war had reached Africa, the Middle East, and the seas. U-boats hunted ships in the Atlantic. The Lusitania was sunk, a passenger liner destroyed by German torpedoes, killing civilians, and turning world opinion further against Germany. The world was now fully at war, from the sands of Mesopotamia to the skies above France. By the last days of August 1914, the maps in every general's office had changed shape daily. Lines moved, borders blurred, armies collided and recoiled. But by the end of that month, one truth was clear. The world's old order was gone, and the Great War had begun in full. The Battle of the Frontiers. Between August 14th and August 25th, France launched a massive offensive along its eastern borders, a chain of battles historians would later call the Battle of the Frontiers. It was meant to reclaim Alsace and Lorraine, the lost provinces of 1871. But instead of victory, France met a storm of machine guns and artillery fire. Their bright red trousers and blue jackets stood out against the fields, making them easy targets for German gunners. In the forests near Charleroi, entire French regiments vanished under shell fire. The air was filled with the shriek of shells and the crash of collapsing trees. One officer wrote, "We marched into a storm of iron. Men fell like wheat before a scythe." By August 24th, the French armies were in retreat across the entire front. The offensive had cost nearly 300,000 casualties in less than 2 weeks. And the war, only a month old, had already broken the illusion of quick victory. The British at Mons. Meanwhile, the British Expeditionary Force, barely 70,000 men, faced the full weight of the German advance near the Belgian town of Mons. They were outnumbered 4-1. The men of the BEF were professionals, calm, precise riflemen whose discipline shocked their enemies. When the Germans advanced across open ground, the British volleys were so rapid and accurate that survivors believed they were facing machine guns, but sheer numbers overwhelmed them. By evening on August 23rd, the British were ordered to withdraw. It was the beginning of a long, grueling retreat southward toward France. As they marched, rain fell, roads turned to mud, and exhausted soldiers fought skirmishes by the light of burning villages. One soldier wrote in his diary, "We no longer sleep. We only march and fire and march again." The Great Retreat. For 2 weeks, the Allied armies retreated. Fighting, resting, moving again. Civilians fled in the opposite direction, carrying children, blankets, and photographs. The roads of France were rivers of humanity. The German advance seemed unstoppable. In Berlin, church bells rang for victory. In Paris, the government prepared to evacuate. Officials burned documents in courtyards. The city waited in silence. But on the night of September 3rd, something shifted. The miracle of the Marne. The German army, stretched thin and exhausted, was only a few days' march from Paris. Its supply lines were overextended. Its troops had been marching for nearly a month. French General Joseph Joffre saw his chance. He rallied his forces and ordered a counterattack along the Marne River. Taxis from Paris, hundreds of them, were commandeered to carry troops to the front lines. Drivers who had never left the city now carried soldiers and ammunition into battle. On September 6, 1914, the Battle of the Marne began. It raged for a week, an inferno of gunfire, smoke, and confusion. But the French held. By September 12th, the German advance halted. The enemy that had seemed unstoppable was now in retreat. The miracle of the Marne, they called it. But the miracle came at a cost. Hundreds of thousands dead, and a battlefield littered with the wreckage of both armies. The race to the sea. Neither side could outflank the other. From the Marne, the armies began to dig. First shallow trenches for protection, then deeper ones for shelter. Each day, the lines of trenches extended farther north, each side trying to reach the coast before the other could. By October 1914, from Switzerland to the North Sea, a continuous line of trenches stretched over 400 miles, a scar across Europe. This was no longer a war of movement. It had become a war of endurance. The race to the sea ended not in victory, but in a stalemate that would last for years. Trench life begins. At first, soldiers thought the trenches were temporary. They dug with shovels, expecting to move again in days. But the rain came. The trenches flooded. The walls turned to mud. Men slept standing, their boots filled with water. Rats fed on the dead. The smell of rot and gas filled the air. Letters home changed tone. No more talk of quick victories. Only survival. "We live like moles," one French soldier wrote. "The earth is our friend and our coffin." The world had entered a new kind of war. A mechanical, industrial slaughter that no one had imagined. Reflections, the end of the beginning. By the end of September 1914, Europe was unrecognizable. The old dreams of glory were gone, replaced by fear and disbelief. The war that leaders promised would last months had already consumed 500,000 lives. From the palace in Vienna to the trenches of Flanders, the same realization spread. No one would be home by Christmas. The spark from Sarajevo had become a firestorm. The world had changed, not in decades, but in weeks. This was only the beginning. The next years would bring gas, tanks, and endless mud. Empires would fall. nations would vanish, and the very idea of civilization would be tested. It is not the end. In the next video, we will go step by step into the trenches, into the daily life, the propaganda, and the struggle to survive in the new world born from the spark in Sarajevo. By late 1915, the world had adapted to war. Every nation had bled, yet none had surrendered. New inventions appeared. Flamethrowers, poison gas shells, even primitive tanks still in secret design. War was no longer about courage. It was about endurance. Letters from the dead. Across Europe, letters continued to arrive. Mothers opened envelopes months after their sons had died. The handwriting, fading and shaky, often ended with the same line: "Don't worry, I'll be home soon." They never came home. Entire villages lost every man of fighting age. Church bells tolled so often that some towns stopped ringing them entirely. There was no need. The grief was constant. The turning of minds. In parliaments and drawing rooms, leaders began to realize there could be no quick peace. And yet, no one dared to stop. They had sacrificed too much to turn back. Every death became justification for more deaths. By the end of 1915, the map of Europe looked unchanged. But beneath the soil, millions of bodies were buried. The end of the beginning. The spark of Sarajevo had become a furnace consuming continents. The world stood at the edge of something unthinkable. A new kind of total war, fought by nations, endured by all of humanity. Voice lowers, soft fade-out music begins. This is not the end. In the next video, we move deeper, into the trenches, into the gas, into the breaking of empires. The story of World War I has only begun. The last days of July were filled with confusion and dread. In Berlin, crowds gathered outside the palace, chanting for war. In London, clerks stayed late in the Foreign Office, decoding frantic messages from ambassadors abroad. On July 31st, Germany sent an ultimatum to Russia: "Cease your mobilization within 12 hours, or we shall mobilize." No reply came. At dawn on August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. Across Europe, church bells tolled. Some in triumph, some in terror. Men cheered in the streets, waving flags and throwing flowers, still believing it would be a short war. Women wept in silence at the train stations. The web tightens. That same day, France ordered mobilization. Germany declared a state of imminent danger of war. The Schlieffen Plan, Germany's blueprint for invasion through Belgium, was taken from shelves. The fuse was now burning from both ends. On August 2nd, German troops entered Luxembourg and demanded passage through Belgium. King Albert refused. "Belgium is a nation, not road," he said. The world would remember those words. On August 3rd, Germany declared war on France. French troops began crossing into Alsace, while civilians in Paris cheered trains leaving for the front, unaware that half of those men would never return. The next day, August 4th, 1914, Germany invaded Belgium. The first artillery shells hit Liège. That same evening, Britain declared war on Germany. In London, Sir Edward Grey stood by his window, watching gas lamps flicker on across the city. He said quietly, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." The age of peace ends. The world that had existed for 100 years, the world of kings, culture, and calm, was gone. Europe was at war, and none of its leaders knew that it would last not weeks, but years, and claim more than 16 million lives. The spark from Sarajevo had finally become a firestorm. By the final weeks of 1914, the Western Front had solidified. Tens of thousands of soldiers faced each other across a barren strip of land, the narrow, deadly space known as No Man's Land. It was only a few hundred yards wide, but it might as well have been another world. Digging into the earth, trenches began as shallow ditches, a few feet deep, just enough to survive artillery. But as the war continued, they evolved into vast systems of defense. Frontline, support, and reserve trenches, connected by narrow communication tunnels. Each army mirrored the other. Between them lay wire corpses and craters filled with rainwater. Rats thrived. Men lived knee-deep in mud. They fought not only the enemy, but the ground itself. "We no longer see the sky," a French soldier wrote. "Only the mud and the wire, and the faces of the dead who stare back at us." Weapons of the new age. To survive in the trenches, soldiers adapted quickly. They made periscopes from mirrors, grenades from tin cans, and weapons from shovels. Snipers ruled the daylight. Artillery ruled the night. The machine gun had made courage obsolete. Now, progress was measured in yards, and each one cost hundreds of lives. Command from afar. Behind the lines, generals and chateaus issued orders by telegram. They believed they could control the war from maps and telephones. But on the front, men crawled through filth and frostbite, waiting for orders that made no sense. This was not the war they had imagined, not the clean, swift battles of old, but something mechanical, endless, and inhuman. By December, the trenches stretched from the Alps to the sea. The war was locked. Neither side could move. The quiet before the truce. Snow began to fall across Flanders. Men wrapped their rifles in rags to keep them from freezing. They sang to stay awake, to forget where they were. The air was still, as if even the wind had grown tired of the sound of war. The first Christmas of the Great War was approaching, and soon, for one brief night,